You, 1983, go to the arcade with a couple of friends in a sock full of quarters, ready to conquer the game no one could. Dragon Slayer. Quarter after quarter you pump into the machine. All the dogs you walked, all those lawns you mowed, all those quarters for all those plays. Have them wiped out in an hour due to QTEs. You stand there, man to the store, and your friends laughing at you for failing yet again. Just like the failures before you.
This is the worst time in my entire...
So why are you a failure? Maybe it's just because no one ever liked you in the first place, but maybe, just maybe, the game was rigged on purpose. Arcade games back in the mid to late 1900s had one goal in mind: as much money from any person that tries to beat them. Look at carnival games, for example. While they're not necessarily arcade games, their entire purpose is to make people pay an entry fee that costs more than the prize that they'll actually win. And carnival games are pretty similar to arcade games too, as you go and pay more money to get more attempts at getting the prize, while when you play an arcade game, you put in more money to get more lives to then play the game for longer and get a higher score, which usually doesn't matter in the end, but hey, you get bragging rights. So maybe you're not a failure after all, because the game's difficulty in the first place was hard, so you get to go and pay more money in order for you to go and play it for longer. But wasn't the challenge of the game that got you to play it in the first place? Well, you'd be correct if video games were still played at arcades, but as time went on, home consoles started to pop up, such as the NES and Genesis, which allowed people to go and play these games at their home. But the downside to these games, which were mainly arcade games, were their longevity. Let me explain it like this. Most arcade games have a player versus player mechanic, or a sort of linear progression mechanic inside the game that is its foundation, meaning that you just go from point A to point B within a game and you finish it, or you go and constantly fight the same battle over and over again with the same person. This can pass in an arcade full of games because you don't go to the arcade that often. You have people coming over to you and watching you play the game or playing with you, and you have access to so many different types of arcade games, but when it comes down to a singular game for a home console, that's a different story. With the system, the goal for games changed for designers, as instead of being published out to a company for a one-time purchase, they'd be selling it to multiple people across the world for an absurdly high price that people usually can't pay. Because back then it was like $130 that you could go and get a game. So imagine that you pay that much money in order for you to get something that lasts 3 hours. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. So then, game designers went through the best phase ever: experimental design.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Woo. Artificial challenges come in varying amounts, some that are not hidden at all, but some that are very, very, very cleverly hidden. And because of that, there isn't necessarily any issue with these artificial challenges inside of these video games. But the issue being, with at least the hard mode inside of these games, is that whenever artificial challenges are introduced into them, they usually just bumps up the health and damage of every enemy. And it's really easy for developers to do, but not for us elite sports gamers. We don't want that stuff. We want rough, tough, and shooting, boot and killing, realistic mode in Call of Duty. Why did they make that? I don't know why. I hate that so much. My least favorite mode in any Call of Duty. My God. But as the gaming industry grew, so did the communities that supported them, as they then started to go and critique the various issues with video games, one of them being difficulties inside of them. Various online communities can and have helped developers better understand their games and their faults to them, by utilizing things such as forums and the bug tools that are given by game developers to their audience so that they can go and report whatever issues they have. One game that has the magnum opus to difficulties, though, is the game The Last of Us Part 2, as while the game overall is mediocre, the gameplay is kind of brutal. And with this brutality comes a fairly modular difficulty system, allowing the player to go and change every facet of the game, all the way from having enemies that can flank you from the sides and attack you with the very strategic types of orientations, or you can play hide and seek with Helen Keller. Your choice. All jokes aside, though, this is a very good way for players to go and set difficulty inside their game, as it allows them to go and set what is difficult in the game and what isn't difficult enough in the game. So you can make loot more scarce, like the world got scavenged, surprise, or you can also make it where your companions do far less damage if you don't want them to steal your kills. One game in particular, though, called Left 4 Dead 2 has an AI pulling the strings in the back, as while Left 4 Dead 2 has a difficulty setting like listing that you can go and choose from, This AI is probably one of the best when it comes to a dynamic difficulty. It controls not only the items and enemies that the player faces per campaign differently in different ways, but at the same time, it also goes and changes the mood of the game through player dialogue, visual effects, and sound effects even, in such a dynamic way that it's insane. This allows the game to feel far more vibrant and far more harsher depending on what difficulty you have, making it where the player can go and find a different weapon that they wanted, or able to find a completely new weapon that would be very opportune in their situation. That's all changed on the spot depending on the AI, and it makes the game feel vibrant without really doing much. The tension in the game is so good I always come back to it every year or so. Just because I love playing through one of the campaigns and just going through a horde of zombies while I have a new weapon every single time. I go from the sniper rifle to the assault rifle to the katana to the fire axe. I go to everything basically. But while Left 4 Dead 2 has one of the best dynamic difficulties that creates the perfect amount of tension inside of each campaign that you play, Forza has a questionable way of developing tension. For example, if you outsped some sort of AI in a single player race, you think you'd go past them, but you're wrong. You don't ever think that. In Forza, instead of just going past them, sometimes the AI will just speed up for no reason. They'll just speed up because they want to. This, while adding in a sense of tension to the game, is very artificial, as it feels like the player is getting robbed once they figure out, oh, every single time I go to first place, I immediately get usurped into second place because of some AI just boosting to 200 miles per hour and getting in front of me. That's the tricky issue with dynamic difficulties, because if you don't properly playtest them, people might find it a bit more annoying or even unfair if they go into the higher difficulties and then just get sped out because they were too good for the game. But while dynamic difficulties can fail at preventing the player from cheesing sometimes, when it comes to difficulties that you can just change on the fly, it kind of promotes cheating in a way if the game ever feels unfair to the player. Games such as Skyrim and Fallout 4 have these type of difficulty settings that allow you to go and change them on the spot, but the issue is far more lazier when you realize the developers can just be like, oh, well, if the game's too hard for the player, they can just change the difficulty setting. We don't fuck up anything. The original design for difficulties were prone to this issue, as if someone found the game too hard at a certain section of the game, they couldn't go and change the difficulty on the spot and would have to go back to the start of the game just so they can go and play through the game again on whatever section they failed on before. But with an on-the-fly difficulty type, that's not really an issue. The player can just go and change it if they need to, which kind of unfair because usually it comes down to the game developer not making the game area feel fair. For some reason, games like Oblivion have their modifier at around 6 times the damage, so if you wanted to play on the hardest difficulty, it really wouldn't be fun for you to play at it. For example, if you were an orc and then you used your racial modifiers to go and have a huge bonus to damage, the first enemy you fight in the game legitimately is 2 rats. You either die from the rats from the first time, after you try to even pop your racial modifier that gives you a humongous buff in damage, or you get to like half health and you almost die. So, yeah, it's not really that fair. So you know what? Fuck it. Get rid of the idea of allowing the player to go and choose what they want. Just give them one singular difficulty, and if they play the game, they play the game. From this perspective, the development of the difficulty and the game itself is going to be far more smoother, as there's only one difficulty that exists in the game, so you just go and design everything around that difficulty. There is one issue with this difficulty that is its major flaw, because if you go and play games like Dark Souls, you're going to stumble into this issue. If the difficulty of the game is too high for a player, the player will simply be discouraged and not actually play the game. This doesn't really allow people to go and enter into the game in a very friendly manner, and games like Dark Souls do that. While I like Dark Souls combat, it feels very brutal in some ways, as either I run away like a little bitch from all the normal enemies while I go and cheese the rest of the bosses by dodge rolling into them constantly. For example, dodging into enemies is far more easier than parrying them because, well, there's supposed to be a risk factor with parrying, as you can go and get bunches of damage off of it. But in the end, for newcomers, it's just not a worthwhile risk to take, and they just dodge instead. Yet the gameplay for Dark Souls is so satisfying from a newcomer's perspective. There's all these different ways you can go and play the game that the player doesn't know about, and if you're a brute force kind of fellow, which you need to be if you're a newcomer to Dark Souls, then you'd love this game. But a good majority of people aren't like that because they'd rather want a game they can just pick up and play immediately versus the game they have to learn the mechanics of. Now, this next type of difficulty isn't necessarily a difficulty because it can be either made by the gaming industry or the people that made the game as a way to go and limit themselves in some fashion. that being a gameplay-based difficulty. Basically how this works is the player goes and avoids certain parts of the game so they can go and impose a bigger challenge onto themselves by missing out on the content they could have gotten before. For example, Borderlands 2 has a type of relics in the game called the Allegiance relics, which allow you to gain a bonus to damage depending on the specific brand of weapon that you use. Some of them being huge bonuses that allow you to have a huger mag size, more damage, better fire rates, you get the point. Now the community adapted this relic into the weapons brand only runs that currently exist in Borderlands 2, where players can go and get the certain relics and test their knowledge of the game with one weapon brand only throughout the entirety of the run. Now this gameplay difficulty doesn't seem to be an issue, but there's actually a huge issue with the support behind it and how, in all honesty, the game developers didn't think about the late game of Borderlands 2 whenever they thought of these relics. In the late game of Borderlands 2, you need a way for you to go and slag your enemies, which applies a huge damage modifier on top of them, and you also need a way for you to go and heal off of any enemies that you fight. Now, a certain Jacob's Only run done by a certain YouTuber who may or may not be Jolt's dude had tried to do said run with a character named Zero, but he failed at completing it. Now, why would you think that? Well, it's because the Jacob's run doesn't actually have any slag weapons. You can't ever get a slag weapon in a Jacob's run. So, in order for you to go and get slag of any kind, you'd have to have a character that innately has the ability to slag. Sadly, Zero doesn't have a way to slag, neither does he have any broken mechanic in the game that allows him to do a bunch of damage. Except for Boar, which I already showcased that. Now this is the flaw with gameplay-based difficulties, because if you don't have enough support from it, from either the game developers, and mainly the game developers, then there's going to be no way for the player to actually play through the entirety of the game with it. And that's the issue with Borderlands 2. They always released content all the time, but didn't properly support any of their previous things that they had in the game, those being the Allegiance relics. Otherwise, gameplay-based difficulties are a very good contender for how you can go and give a difficulty to a player, because it can be chosen by the player at different points in the game, while the game developer can also add in that replayability factor of the game by just having it in there in the first place. In the end though, it doesn't really matter which difficulty you have. As long as you put enough polish inside of the game and you make sure it's all squeaky clean when you're done with it, then it'll be good for anyone that tries to go and play it. So even if you have an easy, normal, or hard difficulty, it can still feel fluid and appropriate for whoever tries to play the game. But I'm a fucking dweeb who doesn't even care about what other people have to say, okay? So my difficulty type consists of 3 different things, all right? An easy, a normal, and a hard. Okay, it's kind of a standard difficulty, but there's more to it, okay? There's more to it. Now, I'm gonna go and bring the example down to Breath of the Wild, because right now I'm sounding insane, but basically, think of Breath of the Wild's weapon system and how it could function. And I'm going to propose different functions depending on what difficulty mode it is. Overly complicated? That's how I like it. In the easy mode, the weapon system would be that every single weapon that you'd find would be scarce, would have an infinite durability that would allow you to go and use them as many times as you want as long as you have the weapon. But in a normal mode, the weapons will be far more diverse and far more frequent, but weapons will have durability, usually aiming at the original design of Breath of the Wild. But in a hard mode, it would be that weapons would be scarcer and weapons would also have durability, but there'd be a unique hard mode twist in where you can actually repair your weapons at a blacksmith's place. I don't know if there's even a blacksmith's place in Breath of the Wild, but you can go over there and repair it so that you can go and actually gain your durability back. Having a hard mode that is somewhat fair, but at the same time being challenging for the player and allowing them to have micromanagement inside the game. But there is one more design philosophy that I have when it comes to this type of difficulty, and it's that whenever you get higher and higher up in the difficulties, the more and more accessible types of play styles should be accepted. Now, I have issues like this whenever I play games like Borderlands 2, because when you get to the Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, you have to almost force yourself to go down a certain path in the game. As I said before, slag is almost necessary in the late game when it comes to Borderlands 2, because in order for you to go and deal with the huge health pools, you need that multiplier to go and affect them. And the game even promotes it by making it a 2x multiplier in the previous modes to a 3x multiplier in Ultimate Vault Hunter mode. I would rather make it where the player can go and define what type of element they want to play with the most, and at the same time boost the element's damage to make it where these different elements that the players select and especially optimize themselves in are far more gratifying when you get towards this higher level of difficulty. This is something that even Borderlands 3 did. So they just removed slag from the games because it was just too much of a vital thing. This design choice can further define the class and at the same time allow individuals to go and choose whatever they please, allowing the game to feel far more diverse and have a lot more replayability, while at the same time having that sense of identity that players can have towards the late game, as you're building from the easiest mode all the way up to the hardest mode, going from this person who just uses everything to a person that's honed their abilities in whatever weapon they use currently. This design philosophy isn't new though, because in Breath of the Wild's Master Mode, there's all sorts of new items placed in different locations. Some of them I think are even removed, and at the same time you have to utilize buffs that boost your weapon damage or whatever it may be. These enemies now deal more damage and have health regeneration. So here's a recap. Basically, difficulties suck because developers lazily make them, and the easiest way to go and make a difficulty is just to go and redesign the framework of the game and just change it every single time. That's a very efficient way of doing it. All right, let's do
Video.
now. Okay, bye guys. Have a great day.